Hey everyone, and welcome to a deep dive that is, well, it's going to be a wild one. We're talking about the fall of Bashar al-Assad in Syria, an event that has, it's basically ripped up the rule book for the entire Middle East. I mean, think about it. This is a family that's held power for 54 years, 13 years of a brutal civil war, and then just like that, poof, in 12 days, the whole regime collapses. Assad's fleeing to Moscow, and everyone's left trying to figure out what in the world just happened.
It's really quite remarkable how quickly everything unraveled. The speed of this collapse is what's pretty much unprecedented. Even the sources we've been looking at, Al Jazeera, analysis from the U.S. Institute of Peace, reports from Chatham House, they're all kind of grappling with this, trying to make sense of the chaos
Yeah.
and what it could mean for the future.
Okay, so that's exactly what we're going to try to untangle today. We're not just going to recap what happened. We're going to go deeper, like way deeper. We're going to look at the why, the who benefits, and what happens next. But to do that, I think we need to kind of rewind a bit. We need to understand the whole web of alliances that kept Assad in power for so long.
Yeah, that's definitely a good place to start. You see, Syria's always been this kind of focal point for these big power games.
Yeah.
And the two main players in all this, well, they've been Russia and Iran. Both of them had their own reasons for wanting to keep Assad in power, and their involvement goes way back.
Okay, so let's start with Russia. Why were they so invested in keeping Assad in charge? I know they've had this long relationship, but was it purely strategic, or was there something more to it?
Well, the relationship between Russia and Syria does go back a long way.
Yeah.
It dates back to the Soviet era. Back then, Syria was a key ally for them in the Middle East. And even after the Soviet Union collapsed, Russia held onto their naval base in Tartus. It's a strategically important spot, gives them a foothold in the Mediterranean.
Right, so there's the strategic element. But then you have Assad going to Moscow in 2004 to sort of renew those ties and modernize his military. So was that just about like helping out an old friend, or was there a bigger game at play?
I think it's really important to remember what was going on in the world back then.
Okay, yeah, that's true.
I mean, the U.S. had just invaded Iraq in 2003,
Yeah.
and Russia was, well, they were definitely worried about the West getting too much influence in the region, so supporting Assad. It was a way for them to push back against that,
Yeah.
to maintain their own presence in the Middle East.
So it's like a mix of that old Cold War rivalry, but also some very real strategic interests. Makes sense. Okay, but what about Iran? Their alliance with Syria seems like it was less about history and more about having a common enemy.
Yeah, you're right. While Russia's involvement had those deep roots in history and geopolitics, Iran's motivation, well, it really stemmed from their shared hatred of Saddam Hussein back in the 70s. Saddam's regime in Iraq.
Right, so the enemy of my enemy is my friend kind of thing.
Exactly. And then when the U.S. invaded Iraq in 2003 and removed Saddam from power, well, that just cemented the alliance between Iran and Syria even further.
Right, and then there's that whole Shia crescent idea that Iran has been pushing for years. That concept of a block of Shia majority countries stretching all the way from Iran to the Mediterranean. I'm guessing Syria was a pretty important part of that vision.
Oh, absolutely. Syria, with its large Shia population, was a key link in that chain.
It was like the bridge.
Exactly. So by backing Assad, Iran wasn't just gaining an ally against their enemies. They were also boosting their own influence in the region, projecting their power all the way to the Mediterranean.
So both Russia and Iran had a lot riding on Assad staying in power. But then, as we know, everything changed incredibly fast. It seems like they were both caught totally off guard. I mean, especially considering they were so close to actually securing Assad's regime.
It definitely surprised a lot of people. And I think it reveals a kind of weakness in both Iran and Russia's strategies. The U.S. Institute of Peace argues that they were so focused on the military side of things that they kind of overlooked what was happening inside Syria. They underestimated those internal pressures and the potential for the whole thing to just collapse from within.
That's fascinating. So it wasn't just about military strength, it was about internal stability, which they both misjudged. Okay, so let's talk about the fallout, starting with Iran. They poured a ton of resources into keeping Assad afloat. And now they've lost a crucial ally, not to mention that direct land route to Hezbollah in Lebanon. So what does this mean for their whole regional strategy, especially given all the tension with Israel lately?
Well, this is a huge blow to Iran's ambitions in the region. They've lost a vital ally in Syria, and their ability to easily supply and support Hezbollah has been seriously disrupted. And Hezbollah is a crucial part of Iran's forward defense strategy, which basically means projecting their power beyond their own borders through these allied groups and proxies.
Hold on, I think we need to unpack that a little bit for our listeners. This whole forward defense concept sounds a bit like something out of a military textbook.
Yeah, that is a bit of a complex idea.
Yeah.
But essentially, it's about creating this buffer zone by supporting groups like Hezbollah outside of Iran's own borders.
Hmm.
It lets them exert influence, deter attacks, project power, all without having to directly engage in conflicts themselves. And Syria was vital for this strategy. It was the land bridge that connected Iran to Hezbollah in Lebanon.
Right, so Syria was like this key piece on their chessboard, and now that piece is gone.
Exactly.
And on top of that, Hezbollah, their main proxy in the region, they're weakened after those clashes with Israel. So Iran's surrounded by enemies, their ally is gone, their proxy is struggling. It sounds like they're in a very precarious position right now.
They are definitely facing some serious challenges. Their influence in the region is waning. They might feel cornered and lash out in unpredictable ways. Some experts are even saying that they might double down on their nuclear program, as a last-ditch effort to project strength and deter further attacks.
Wow, that's a pretty scary thought. Iran going nuclear would be a total game changer for the region and for the world.
Okay, let's shift gears and talk about Russia for a minute. They've also invested heavily in propping up Assad, both militarily and financially. So how does his sudden fall impact their standing on the world stage, especially with the war in Ukraine still dragging on?
Well, it's a major setback for Putin. It undermines his whole goal of trying to reassert Russia as this global superpower. They couldn't even protect their ally in Syria. It makes them look weak, unreliable. And this is all happening while they're already bogged down in Ukraine, facing international condemnation and economic sanctions.
Right, it's like a double whammy for them. Loss of prestige on the world stage and a strategic setback in a region they've been trying to dominate. And what about the loss of their naval base in Tartus? That was a pretty big deal for them, right? Gave them that power projection in the Mediterranean.
Yeah.
Well, absolutely. And while some sources think Russia might try to negotiate some kind of continued presence, there's no doubt that their ability to project power in the region has been diminished. It adds another layer of complexity to their already difficult situation in Ukraine and globally.
So it sounds like both Russia and Iran are reeling from this sudden power shift. But whenever there's a power vacuum, someone usually steps in to fill it. And in this case, all eyes are on Turkey. They've been backing the opposition to Assad for years. So what does this new reality mean for them?
Well, Turkey now finds itself in a very strong position. Chatham House, in their analysis, points out that Turkey has effectively outmaneuvered both Russia and Iran. They've gained leverage over this crucial corridor that links Europe and the Gulf.
It's a pretty remarkable turnaround for them, but can they actually control this new landscape? I mean, they've got to navigate relationships with all these different Syrian factions, some of which are more aligned with them than others. Plus, they have their own internal issues with the Kurdish population.
Yeah, that's the question. The situation they've inherited is anything but stable. Managing all those different factions and competing interests inside Syria, it's going to be a delicate balancing act. And as you said, they have their own challenges to deal with at home.
Like they've won this prize, but they weren't quite ready for it.
Okay, but we can't forget that this isn't just about power plays between countries. This is about the Syrian people, people who have endured over a decade of brutal conflict. So what does Assad's fall actually mean for them? Will they finally find some peace and stability, or is this just the beginning of a whole new chapter of uncertainty?
That's the most crucial question, and sadly, it's one that often gets lost in all the geopolitical maneuvering. The truth is, the future for the Syrian people is still very uncertain, and their fate is going to be shaped by the decisions and actions of those now vying for control. It's a sobering thought. While we're here analyzing all the power shifts and the strategic implications, it's important to remember the human cost of this conflict. We'll delve deeper into the potential scenarios for Syria's future in the next part of our deep dive. And we're back, picking up where we left off. With a Syria that's suddenly without Assad after decades of his family calling the shots, we talked about the shockwaves this sent through the region, especially for Iran and Russia. But now we've got this massive power vacuum, and I'm guessing it's not going to stay empty for long.
Oh, you're absolutely right. And that's where things get even trickier. It's easy to get caught up in those first reactions, the geopolitical chess moves and all that. But the real challenge is figuring out the long-term consequences.
Yeah.
Whoever fills that void left by Assad, well, they're going to determine what Syria looks like for years to come.
So it's less about the initial shock and more about the nitty-gritty of how power actually changes hands on the ground.
Precisely. We have to look beyond the headlines. We need to understand the dynamics within Syria itself. And all of our sources point to the fact that there's no single group ready to just step in and take over. Instead, we're looking at this fractured landscape. with a ton of different factions, each with their own agenda. It's not going to be a smooth transition.
Okay, so no clear heir apparent, which makes sense after years of civil war and all these different groups fighting against Assad. And our sources all seem to agree that this idea of like a simple, unified transition to democracy, well, that's pretty much off the table. So if it's not going to be one group taking over, who are the main players we should be watching?
Well, one group that's been getting a lot of attention, and they played a key role in Assad's downfall, is Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, HTS for short. They're a powerful force, deep roots in the opposition movement. But their Islamist ideology makes some regional players pretty nervous, especially the UAE.
So some might be cautiously optimistic about HTS, while others are looking at them with suspicion, unsure of what a Syria under their influence might look like. It's like everyone's holding their breath.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. And then you have the Syrian National Army, which is this loose coalition of rebel groups. They've been getting support from Turkey. And given those close ties to Turkey, they're likely to have a big say in how things unfold, especially in those areas that border Turkey.
So we've got HTS, we've got the Syrian National Army, and then this whole mix of other factions, some more moderate, some more extreme. It sounds like a recipe for potential conflict, with all these groups vying for power and influence.
The potential for conflict is definitely there. And that's why the international community, especially those countries that have been involved in the Syrian conflict, well, they're watching very closely. Nobody wants to see Syria descend into even more chaos and violence, especially after everything it's already been through.
Right, because even though Assad is out of the picture, all those underlying tensions and rivalries that fueled the civil war, well, they haven't just vanished overnight. Okay, so we've got this internal struggle for power brewing. But what about the external players? We talked about Iran and Russia's setbacks, but how are other countries reacting to this new reality?
Well, the U.S. is facing a real dilemma. On the one hand, they're relieved to see Assad gone. He was a major thorn in their side for years. But on the other hand, they're hesitant to get too deeply involved, in what could become another messy and drawn-out conflict in the Middle East.
Yeah, I can see how that would be a tough call. It's that classic U.S. foreign policy dilemma, wanting to influence events.
Exactly. They've already got a lot on their plate. And there's a strong aversion to putting boots on the ground in another Middle Eastern quagmire. The U.S. Institute of Peace says their likely approach will be to rely on diplomacy and financial aid, to try and nudge things in a direction that benefits them. But their leverage is limited, especially compared to a country like Turkey, which is right there on Syria's doorstep.
That's true. Turkey is in a much stronger position to exert influence, both geographically and politically. They've got the military presence, the relationships with key players on the ground, and they're directly affected by what happens in Syria, especially when it comes to the flow of refugees.
Precisely. But as we discussed earlier, having that much influence doesn't make things easy. Turkey has to walk a very fine line. They have to balance their own interests, like securing their border and preventing a new wave of refugees, with the needs of the Syrian people and the concerns of their regional partners.
It's like they've been handed the steering wheel of a car that's still careening down a mountain road. There's a lot of potential to crash and burn.
That's a pretty accurate analogy. And speaking of regional partners, we can't forget about the Arab states. They were already starting to normalize relations with Assad before his downfall, hedging their bets in a very fluid situation, and now they're in a really awkward position.
Right, because they were kind of easing back into the fold with Assad, and now they have to figure out how to engage with this whole new set of actors, many of whom they may not trust or agree with. So what are they doing to adapt to this new reality?
Well, they're definitely in a tough spot. They desperately want stability in Syria. But they're also wary of the Islamist ideology espoused by groups like HTS. And let's not forget the lingering trauma from the Arab Spring, which showed them just how quickly things can spiral out of control in the region.
So it's a mix of caution, opportunism, and a healthy dose of anxiety.
That pretty much sums it up. They're trying to assess the situation, figure out who the real power brokers are going to be, and how to best protect their own interests in this new and uncertain landscape.
Okay, we've talked about Iran, the U.S., the Arab states, and of course Turkey, but what about Russia? We know they lost a key ally in Assad, and their influence has taken a hit. But do they really have to completely pack up and leave Syria?
That's a question a lot of experts are debating. Remember, Russia still has that air base in Hymym and the naval facility in Tartus. These are valuable assets, both strategically and symbolically. It's unlikely they'll give them up without a fight.
That makes sense, but maintaining those bases is going to be tricky now that Assad is gone. They're going to need some kind of agreement with whoever ends up in charge, right?
Absolutely. And that's where things get really interesting. Al Jazeera reported that during those recent negotiations in Doha, both Russia and Iran seemed resigned to Turkey's ascendancy in Syria. It suggests they might be willing to cut a deal. One that allows them to keep some kind of presence in Syria, maybe a reduced one, in exchange for recognizing Turkey's sphere of influence.
So it's like a geopolitical poker game. Everyone's trying to figure out what cards the other players are holding and how to play their own hand to get the best possible outcome.
Exactly. And in this high-stakes game, information is key.
Speaking of information, I'm curious about the role of intelligence agencies in all of this. Our sources haven't said much about what's happening behind the scenes, in the world of
Well,
espionage.
that's because intelligence operations are, by their very nature, secretive. But it's safe to assume that agencies like the CIA, Mossad, and Turkey's MIT, they're all working overtime, gathering intel, assessing the situation, and advising their governments on how to proceed.
I can only imagine the scramble that's happening right now. Analysts poring over satellite images, agents trying to cultivate sources within the different factions, and policymakers trying to make sense of it all.
Oh, you can bet on it.
Yeah.
And the stakes are incredibly high. What happens in Syria could have a huge impact on the balance of power. In the entire region and beyond.
It's a reminder that while we're discussing this from a distance, there are real people whose lives are being upended by these events.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important to remember the human cost of this conflict. In all this talk of geopolitics and power struggles, it's easy to forget about the millions of Syrians who have been displaced, who have lost loved ones, and who are struggling to rebuild their lives.
It's easy to forget that behind the headlines and the political maneuvering, there are real people whose futures are hanging in the balance.
And their future is still very much uncertain. Will this change in leadership bring the peace and stability they so desperately crave? Or will they continue to be caught in the crossfire of competing factions and regional rivalries?
That's the question that hangs over everything else we've discussed. It's a sobering reminder that the decisions made in the halls of power have real consequences for real people.
And it underscores the importance of finding a solution, one that addresses the needs of the Syrian people, not just the interests of outside powers.
I think that's a perfect transition to our next segment, where we'll explore what a future Syria might look like, and what role the Syrian people themselves might play in shaping their own destiny. Okay, so we're back for the final part of our deep dive into Syria after Assad. We've covered a lot of ground: the collapse of the regime, the scramble for power, all the anxiety from the regional players. But now I want to look ahead. What might a future Syria actually look like?
Well, that's the big question, isn't it? It's tempting to try and predict the future, to say with certainty what's going to happen. But the reality is that Syria's future is still very much up in the air. Our sources offer some clues, some potential scenarios, but it's all a bit hazy right now, like trying to see through a dust cloud.
Okay, so no crystal ball, but some educated guesses based on what we know so far. I'm all ears. What are some things we can probably rule out? Scenarios that are unlikely to play out?
One thing we could pretty much rule out is that idea of a smooth and orderly transition to democracy, the kind that some people hoped for back during the Arab Spring.
Yeah, those days of optimism seem like a long time ago now.
They do, don't they?
Mm-hmm.
The situation in Syria is just way too complex. The divisions run too deep for that kind of simple transition. The U.S. Institute of Peace makes a good point in their analysis. They say there's a lot of resentment towards Iran for propping up Assad's brutal regime for so long. So any chance of Iran maintaining its influence in a post-Assad Syria, well, is pretty slim.
So we can cross off a pro-Iranian government in Damascus. That makes sense. But if Iran is out of the picture, who steps in to fill that vacuum? Is it just going to be a free-for-all between all those different factions we talked about?
It's not so much about one specific country or group taking over. It's more about a fundamental shift in how the whole region operates. We're moving away from those Cold War echoes and the ideological ambitions of the Shia Crescent, and towards a more practical approach. Everyone's starting to focus more on their own self-interests.
Okay, so less about grand visions and more about what's in it for me. Give me some concrete examples of what that might look like on the ground.
Sure, let's start with Turkey. They're going to be totally focused on securing their border and preventing another massive wave of refugees coming in. They'll probably push for a government in Damascus that's friendly to their interests, but that could backfire and alienate other players in the region.
And the Arab states, they're in a tough spot, aren't they? They want stability in Syria, But they're also nervous about empowering groups like HTS, which they see as a potential threat.
Exactly. Chatham House predicts that Saudi Arabia, Jordan, and other Arab states, they're all going to have to completely rethink their approach to Syria. No more cozying up to Assad or trying to play both sides. They now have to figure out how to engage with this whole new group of actors, many of whom they don't fully trust.
And all of this is happening while they're also keeping a close eye on Israel, which has its own security concerns with a new Syrian government potentially aligning more closely with the Palestinians.
Yeah, it's like someone just flipped a chessboard,
Yeah.
and everyone's scrambling to figure out where they stand in this new order.
So lots of uncertainty and maneuvering happening at the regional level. But what about the Syrian people themselves? We've talked about their plight throughout this whole deep dive. But what are their hopes and fears for the future? What do they want to see happen in their country?
That's the most important question. And unfortunately, it's one that often gets lost in all the geopolitical noise.
Mm.
It's interesting. Our sources are great on the political and strategic stuff, but they're surprisingly quiet on the aspirations of the Syrian people themselves.
That is a shame. It's easy to get caught up in the drama of it all. But we can't forget that there are millions of Syrians who have been through unimaginable things. They've lost everything. And they're just trying to survive and rebuild their lives.
Exactly. And that's where you, the listener, come in as you follow the news and try to make sense of what's happening in Syria. I urge you to look beyond the headlines. Ask yourself some questions. What about the Syrian people? Are their voices being heard? Are their needs being met? Are they being given a say in shaping their own future?
It's a call to action for all of us to stay informed, to be critical of the narratives we're being fed, and to remember that behind all the geopolitical maneuvering, there are real people whose lives are on the line.
And that brings me to a final thought, something that our sources didn't really address directly, but it's something I've been thinking about a lot as we've been discussing this. What role could civil society play in shaping Syria's future?
That's an interesting question. We've been so focused on the politicians and the military that we haven't really considered the power of everyday Syrians to influence what happens in their country.
Think about it. Throughout this entire conflict, even during the darkest times, there were countless Syrians working tirelessly for peace, for justice, for a better future. Doctors, teachers, activists, humanitarian workers, all putting their lives on the line to help others and to keep hope alive.
It's true. Their stories often get lost in the shuffle, but they are the ones who have kept Syrian society from completely falling apart. They are the ones who will ultimately rebuild their country, no matter who's in charge.
Exactly. So our challenge to you, the listener, is to pay attention to those voices. Seek out the stories of everyday Syrians, of those working to create a more just and equitable society, because their stories, their resilience, their determination, those are the things that will truly decide Syria's future.
That's a powerful message to end on. We've explored the complexities of the Syrian conflict. The power shifts the uncertainties, the glimmers of hope. But in the end, the future of Syria belongs to the Syrian people.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We hope it's given you a better understanding of the challenges and opportunities that lie ahead for Syria and its people.
And remember, the deep dive never really ends. Keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep seeking out those untold stories.